Hi guys, welcome back or welcome to Switch to Life. And in today's video, we are going to be reviewing the first Pixar movie made in the 2020s. That, of course, is Onward. Speaking of, I kind of feel bad for this movie. This movie was released just 1 week before the COVID-19 pandemic happened, which means that it didn't do so well at the box office. But luckily, just a couple weeks later, it came directly to streaming via Disney Plus, and I would say that it was a pretty successful streaming release. Unfortunately, it also became the film that would make me decide I'm not going to pay to go see a Disney movie in theaters, and then I started this YouTube channel, so now I kind of have to. Anyway, let's talk about the actual movie itself. I would say that this movie is right up there among Pixar's gems. Unfortunately, I would argue it's not perfect. However, we'll talk more about that later. As for now, you just need to know that this movie has some amazing animation. Pixar really blew it out of the park with this one. Although I will admit that the character designs are a little bit weird, but then again, what else are you going to call fantastical, magical creatures? A little bit weird. As for the music, well, I hate to say it, but the music is kind of forgettable, except for that Ride to Valhalla music. That was really cool. As for the voice acting, well, I loved the voice acting here. I especially loved how nervous and fidgety Tom Holland portrayed his character, which is really good, but it was Barley's character, played by Chris Pratt, who really blew me away. I just loved how Chris Pratt was like so dramatic with his line deliveries. As for the other voice actors, they did a pretty good job too, but those are the standouts. Now for the story, and I really love the story. Instead of being this just generic fantasy movie, it's kind of a fantasy-inspired movie set in the modern day. This is basically what would happen if technology mixed with the magical world. Basically, because of the ease of technology, magic is pretty much forgotten. And nothing suffers more than magical creatures. Seriously, they keep dragons as actual pets, basically dogs, and that's just every kind of wrong to me. Even more so, though, is that they pretty much replaced raccoons with unicorns. How do you do that? Another thing we have to talk about is how this movie fits into the Pixar theory, which essentially states that every single Pixar movie exists in one single timeline. Onward is kind of a weird example, but if you want more information, link down below in the description. But the gist of it is that Onward takes place on a completely different planet from Earth when humans on one of the Axiom ships ended up crash landing on the planet and morphed into these magical creatures. Despite that, the story doesn't really revolve around a fantasy-style quest. Well, I mean, it kind of does, but essentially it's about two elf brothers, Ian and Barley Lightfoot. Now, I really love the way this movie portrayed their relationship because it just feels so authentic and very emotional. Pixar is known for their emotions, and this movie definitely played with my emotions, especially at the end. We'll get more into that later, but for now, spoilers are ahead. Essentially, the film introduces us to Ian, who is this really weird, shy kid, but he's not as weird as his big brother Barley, who is a fantasy buff, often playing this Dungeons & Dragons spin-off game, Quest of Yore. And essentially, he just studies fantastical creatures and magic for pretty much his whole life. And he gets into trouble with anybody who's trying to tear down magical relics. One example is when he takes a tree hugger approach and chains himself to a magical dried up fountain where ancient questers used to take breaks. Ian is about to celebrate his 16th birthday, so he's going to try to be a new version of himself, one that's kind of like his dad, where he's confident, he's good with people, and he even knows how to drive, because he still needs to get his driver's license. So the reason is because he never really got to know his dad because his dad died before he was even born. Mom was still pregnant with him. And I really loved the way that they portrayed it. He used an old recording of their dad fixing the plumbing, and he would just listen to it and have a conversation with that recording talking about his day. The reason he wants to be more like his dad is because on his way to school, he just got into a conversation with an old college buddy of his dad. That inspired him to be a more confident version of himself. But unfortunately, when Barley showed up and became the embarrassing fantasy buff that he is, Ian just kind of shied away from embarrassment, and it was a really bad day for him. But when he gets home, his mom decides to give him a birthday present from his dad. She was told not to give it to either of the boys until they were both 16, which I guess in this world is actually the equivalent of becoming an adult, so there's that.
I must dub thee a man today. Kneel before me.
But then they get the birthday present and it's a wizard staff, and there's also a letter that word for word talks about the history of this world that we saw at the very start of the movie. I'm serious, word for word. But then there's also a spell at the end called the Visitation Spell, where essentially, using a Phoenix Gem, the wizard staff can bring someone back from the dead for 24 hours. So Barley, being the magic buff he is, tries to use the staff to conduct the Visitation Spell, but unfortunately, it doesn't work out. So Ian, feeling depressed that he doesn't get to see his dad, just mumbles the spell, and then it starts working. Turns out Ian is the one with the magical gift, not Barley. And I really love that Barley is not jealous of that in the slightest. In fact, I would argue that while he might view Ian as a mage, Barley would view himself as a warrior, and together the two of them would be perfect quest buddies. Granted, Ian doesn't really care that much about quests and magic, so Barley, being the one who actually knows all of the spells, decides to help his brother figure out the magic. Now, let's go back. When Ian was trying to just mumble the spell, he actually did bring his dad back, but unfortunately, the spell went wrong and only his legs were brought back from the dead. He has no upper body. So, turns out they have 24 hours to find another Phoenix Gem, so they can use that to bring their dad back fully from the dead. So they go to the Manticore's Tavern to obtain a map to the Phoenix Gem, at which point, well, they can't get the map, but they did get a child's menu based on the map in the process of burning down the entire tavern by unleashing the Manticore's wrath. And I really love how the movie portrays this because, well, Ian is kind of this shy, vulnerable kid, but throughout this quest, we see him grow to someone who's more confident and a lot more demanding because he only has 24 hours to get the chance to meet his dad. So while he's still a little nervous, he's a lot more confident in his abilities, and it helps him grow and evolve into a man, which is really good. Now, according to the map, they need to follow the Raven's Point, so they decide to go to Raven's Point Mountain. But then Barley says they should take the hard way because the easy way is just way too obvious. However, Ian manages to convince him that because of the 24-hour time limit, they need to take the highway. So they do that, but then over the course of the journey, they get into a lot of trouble, like how you would on a quest. So first they run out of gas, at which point Barley says he doesn't have enough gas left in the tank, but then he gets the idea that Ian could use magic to grow the can and make the amount of gas in the can grow with it. Unfortunately, the spell goes wrong, and instead of growing the can
is huge! And the van is huge! And you're... Oh no.
So they walk to a gas station and fill up the tank, and then they have to bring it back to the car. But in the process, Barley, due to his small pixie size, tries to go talk to some biker pixies, and this ends up getting them into way more trouble and results in a high-speed car chase on the freeway. And due to the dangerous and reckless driving going on, they eventually manage to stop the pixies, but then get pulled over by police officers, at which point Barley makes Ian use a shape-shifting spell to make it so that they can disguise themselves. But in order to keep the disguise alive, they have to not lie. So they disguise themselves as their mom's boyfriend, who just so happens to be a police officer. So pretending to be Chief Bronco and using their dad's body to pretend to be Ian, they decide to say we're actually trying to teach Ian how to drive, which actually was the case because with a Barley shrunk down, Ian had to drive on the freeway during that high-speed car chase. And then Ian starts to get nervous and freak out, but then the police officer says that they know what's going on, and because Chief Bronco is dating Ian and Barley's mom, he's also trying to be a good father figure to Ian and Barley, which is actually the case. Speaking of, there's also a minor reference to a lesbian couple in that scene, so I would call that a win.
My girlfriend's daughter got me pulling my hair out, okay?
But anyway, they talk about how while Ian might be a good kid, Barley is a little bit of a screw-up. And unfortunately, Ian has to answer that question, and he decides, no, I don't think Barley is a screw-up, but the magic reveals that he was lying. So apparently, Barley realizes that his own brother thinks he's a screw-up, and that just makes him very sad and a little bit angry. So they just stop, and he tries to get his anger out, at which point they start playing music in the van, but then their dad, who, despite not having any ears whatsoever, can feel the vibration of the music and starts dancing very badly, and the two of them just laugh over it, at which point Barley and Ian have a heart-to-heart about how if Ian thinks that Barley is a screw-up, how can he think that if he doesn't give Barley a chance? So Ian decides to take Barley's advice, and they go down the path of peril. Meanwhile, while all that is happening, it turns out that their mom realizes that they went missing and that their dad is possibly being brought back from the dead, and they're trying to find a phoenix gem, so they stopped at the Manticore's tavern. So she calls the cops and announces that her boys are missing, which includes contacting her boyfriend, Chief Bronco. So she goes to the Manticore's tavern, where it's practically burned down, and the Manticore is being questioned by the authorities and medics, at which point the Manticore tells her that she forgot to tell her boys about the curse of the Phoenix Gem. So because of that, the mom decides to basically kidnap the Manticore away from the authorities, and they work together to find a magical sword called the Curse Breaker, which would allow them to kill the curse and make it so they can collect the Phoenix Gem safely, but they gotta do it before the boys find the Phoenix Gem. So eventually, the police officers end up tracking down the boys and following them down the path of peril. And Ian is learning a lot about magic when that happens. And eventually, they realize that they're on a bridge, which has a raven at the top pointing the direction to another raven. And supposedly, that raven will point to another raven. And the map said they needed to follow the Raven's Point, not go to Raven's Point. So while Ian is still hesitant and he wants to go to Raven's Point Mountain, he decides to follow Barley's advice and follow the Raven's Point. But it's at that point that Chief Bronco manages to catch up with them, and this leads to a high-speed car chase yet again.
I can't believe I'm running from the cops!
You're not running from the cops. You're running from our mom's boyfriend. Okay, now you're running from the cops.
So Ian and Barley try to run away, and unfortunately they get cornered, at which point Ian tries to do the hardest spell in the wizard's guidebook, which is Archaic Lightning, but he can't do it. So Barley comes up with a better idea. He decides to line up the van, which is named Guinevere, and then he sends her off to Valhalla by having her crash into the mountain. Despite just being a van, Guinevere was a mighty steed. And so Ian and Barley continue on their quest following the ravens, at which point they discover a kind of tablet which tells them to follow the river, and at the end they will find the Phoenix Gem. And so they follow the river, and eventually they go through some booby traps, and then right at the end they manage to climb to the top of the ladder and realize they're back right where they started, at their high school. So Ian is mad at Barley because they followed the wrong clue.
It has to be here. There was a gauntlet. I mean, unless that gauntlet was for, coincidentally, some different quest. That's a possibility.
What?
Instead of going to follow a bunch of Raven's points, they were supposed to go to the mountain Raven's Point. And now they don't have enough time to fully bring their dad back from the dead, so with just his legs, Ian decides to walk off with their dad, and Barley is left to try to figure out how exactly this quest was supposed to go. But then he discovers that a small hole, which is shaped exactly like the small tablet that they took from the Raven's Point, so he inserts it, at which point a small hatch opens, revealing the Phoenix Gem. But when he goes to grab it, he unleashes the curse, which destroys the high school and takes the form of a giant rock dragon. Luckily, that's when their mom and the Manticore show up with the magical sword that can kill the curse, so they get in a fight, at which point Ian and Barley are given enough time to perform the spell, and Ian this time doesn't screw it up, and so they use the Phoenix Gem to bring their dad back from the dead. But unfortunately, the spell is taking too long to actually bring him back, so they have to go back into the battle against the dragon. And I really love how Barley decides Ian should get the chance to meet their dad, but instead, Ian says that Barley deserves the chance to say goodbye. See, Barley only has 4 memories of their dad, one of which is he was hooked up to a bunch of plastic tubes and about to die, and Barley was supposed to say goodbye, but he was so scared that he just couldn't do it, and ever since he regretted it, and from that day on said that he would never be afraid of anything again. But when Ian realizes this, he says that Barley deserves the chance to get to say goodbye to their dad. See, Ian never really got to meet his dad because he wasn't born in time. But because of that, that just means that he had a list of things he wanted to do with his dad. And it was a very long list. But essentially, as he was crossing things off because he couldn't do them because their dad was just a pair of legs at this point, he realized that he kind of already did those things with Barley, not their dad. Barley was basically his dad. He helped raise Ian into the person he is today. Sure, Barley might be a little weird and embarrassing, then again, what family member isn't? But being an older brother, he took on a responsibility to help raise Ian, and that just made him into a man, and I really loved that. And when Ian realized that, he went back to apologize to Barley, and so Barley is going to get the chance to say goodbye to his dad, while Ian fights back against the cursed dragon with his magical powers that he learned from Barley, including the hardest magical spell to learn, Archaic Lightning, which I really loved. Eventually, he uses a levitation spell to strike the cursed dragon with the curse breaker sword, at which point the dragon dies and becomes a pile of rubble, but it surrounds Ian to the point where he can't escape, and through a hole, he gets to see Barley say goodbye to their dad, which is actually kind of sad because that just means Ian never gets the chance to actually meet their dad. But at first, when I first watched the movie, I kind of thought that ruined the whole movie. But over time, I realized that actually just makes the movie even better. With Ian not getting to meet his dad, and not regretting it, mind you, he gets to see that Barley was his father figure, and I really liked that. My personal favorite moment is when they're almost about to drown, Barley is the one who makes sure that Ian gets to breathe before he does. So after spending a minute or two saying goodbye, their dad disappears, at which point Barley tries to dig Ian out of the rubble, and then the two of them have a fun heart-to-heart moment where it gets really emotional, and I just love how their dad says that Barley needs to give Ian a hug from him. So, with the quest completed, life returns to normal. Ian uses his magical wizard powers to put the school back together, and then Barley uses his money to buy a new van, but then Ian decides to paint it and name it Guinevere II. And I love how at the start of the movie, both of the boys don't really like Chief Bronco, but now by the end, they're actually getting along as if he's become like their uncle in a way. And so the two brothers, having grown closer, go onward to their next quest. Just a normal day in high school. And that's the end of the movie. And I really enjoyed it because I really loved the dynamic between Ian and Barley. Barley might be a screw up, really weird, and especially embarrassing, but despite all that, he stuck out for his family and helped raise Ian to be the man he is. And Ian grew from this shy kid to be more confident thanks to the quest. And of course, the quest just brought them closer together, despite the fact that even though it was a bit of a failure, the quest was that they would reunite their family, and in a way, that's exactly what happened. Now, I will admit this movie isn't really that perfect. It's pretty cringy at some moments, and it's not as funny as some of the other Pixar movies, but in terms of emotion, it's there, and it definitely nails the whole and deserves a spot as another Pixar gem. Kinda crazy that this movie is 5 years old now, and well, after all this time, we do have a question to ask. Could there be a sequel to Onward? Well, never say never, but at this point in time, I vote no, because the original movie is just so good and it wraps up the story so nicely. And honestly, I can't imagine Ian and Barley going on another quest that warrants another movie. So with that in mind, what do you guys think of this movie? Make sure to leave your thoughts down below in the comment section, and also feel free to subscribe to my membership program by clicking the join button, or you can just do the free option and subscribe the normal way. But with that in mind, I hope you're all staying safe out there, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye bye.
This is amazing! You still got the rope, right?
Yeah, I got it!